That's
you
fine.
the file. Okay.
Yeah, yeah, that's fine. That's fine.
All right.
That's fine.
Sorry for the bumpy start. God.
It's good. It's good.
I've watched a little bit of each of the other two that you did. I haven't watched the full. But I
Uh-huh.
do. So I kind of know a little bit of what you're looking at and what you're interested in. And I've got like roughly 2 hours is the best time I could carve out. And then I pick
Okay.
up my son from school, but maybe two and a little bit.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
But also you might find that I don't actually have a lot to say on it as well. So if you want to cut it at 1 hour, that's totally fine too. You just let me know. As long as you're interested, I'll keep talking.
Yeah, no, I'm interested. Okay. Yeah, let's start. So what is your connection to religion,
Mm.
if there's any?
Um, I have quite a bizarre, I think, connection to God. I guess it's religion, but probably more so God. Like I would speak about it as um, I feel I've always had some relationship with God, and it's just always been quite, I mean, I want to say intuitive, but obviously I believe I picked these ideas up along the way somewhere, but there is some that I've never I guess I've never faltered in that respect. Like I've always felt some kind of personal relationship to God. And I guess when I say God, it would be more of a Christian God. Um, so if I'll give you a little bit of context maybe of my upbringing and my background, which will probably take a long time, but might I think part of the struggle here is I've never really thought a lot about this in a kind of formal chronological manner. So this is going to be me piecing it together out loud with you to some
Mhm.
extent. Um, so um, so my father was Greek, so he was born and raised on a Greek island. And obviously Greek Orthodox because like 99% um,
Mhm.
of people in Greece, especially back in that time, were. Um, and yeah, I mean, Greek Orthodox in the sense that, yeah, it's very much tied with cultural identity as opposed to any. I never got the sense from him that there was any real deep religious kind of aspect to it for him, like no personal, like, or no relationship with God per se. It was much more a cultural identity kind of thing. And he was born in Greece at the tail end of World War II when the Italians had occupied his island. And so, the Greek Orthodox religion was particularly potent in that regard, as being, something they held on to that informed their identity. And so it was important to him in that respect. Like the Greek church as a concept was sort of important culturally, but he never
Mhm.
instilled in me there was never any detail. There was never any discussion of
Mhm.
actual religious principles, or it was just all about, if you're somewhere and there's a Greek Orthodox church, you should go because it's beautiful, like go.
Mhm.
And he definitely had, it was definitely very much, there was something mysterious, like it was beautiful in the true sense of the word. And you go there and it's, awe-inspiring. And he knew lots of the traditions, obviously. And so he would talk to me about some of those, but it was very surface level, like you do these things, not because
Mhm.
here's the meaning that lies underneath it. Um, and so I do believe that he really felt connected to the sort of mystery and the awe of it, and to some degree that there was something kind of sacred going on. But from the conversations I did have with him that were more direct, even near the end of his life, he would say to me, "I don't really think there's a God. I don't really think anything happens after you die." Um, yeah. So that was my dad, and then my mum is from New Zealand, and her background
Mhm.
is like English, Scottish, German ancestry. So she grew up technically, I think, in an Anglican family,
Mm,
um, more so led by her mother, though. Her father had been a prisoner of war in World War II, and when he came back from the war, my understanding from what's been passed down to me anyway, is that he had lost all belief in God or meaningful religion, or he was witness to some horrendous atrocities, and so he was not interested anymore in ever going to church again or ever pursuing any kind of religious faith. But he knew that my grandmother, that still mattered to her. So he said, "You can do that, but I'm having nothing to do with it," kind of thing. And so I think when my mum and her siblings were being raised, my grandmother was very much Anglican, and she would go to church every Sunday, and she was involved in lots of sort of charitable activities and sort of giving back and church-based community activities. And I think that she involved my mum and her siblings, on and off to some degree. But there was kind of this the influence of my grandfather, I guess, which was also that, I don't mind the kids going, but I don't want them being sort of indoctrinated. And so I think it was a bit of push and pull. Um, for example, I think my mum has told me that they did go to Sunday school for a while or something like it. And then my grandfather found out that they were learning about sin or something, and he said, "I don't want them learning those sorts of concepts." And so, like, so they're definitely not doing that again. And so, what
mhm,
he said went. And so I think my grandmother was just trying to negotiate whatever kind of connection with the Anglican Church she could with my mum. But again, all of that to say that even though my mum might have gone to church and things growing up, and I would not call her religious. She would not call herself religious, I don't think. I don't know. Um,
mhm,
so she eventually met my father, and when they got married, she became Greek Orthodox. And
mm,
they went and lived in the island where my father was from. They eventually went and lived there for 8 years before they had kids. And so my mum was very much, she learned Greek fluently. She was very culturally Greek. She learned kind of the cultural grammar and everything. And she did the cooking, and she was like um, a white New Zealand Greek woman on a Greek island. So again, she would be similar to my dad in terms of the Greek Orthodox Church means something to her in terms of she sees it as being very I mean, I would use the word sacred, like there's something about it that she has a real respect for. But in terms of true religious connection or really um,
mhm,
believing in sort of God or more deeply or fun. I would say there's not a lot there. I don't think that she has much. She has much connection in that respect. So anyway, this is like my family history. They when they got pregnant with me, they decided to move to New Zealand, where my mother's parents were at the time.
mhm,
So I was born in like a very small town in New Zealand in the 80s. No other Greeks around. And both my parents were technically Greek Orthodox, but we were in, New Zealand, small town New Zealand. So it's a bit of a mixture of things and influences, which you can probably hear already. And so I technically was baptized Greek Orthodox, but to do that, um, I don't think there was any Greek Orthodox church in New Zealand at all at the time. There definitely
mm,
wasn't where I was. I know when I was like about 8, they built one finally in Wellington, which is the capital. But there were no Greek Orthodox churches around. So to get baptized, I had to come to Sydney, which is where I live now in Australia. So go to a different country where my dad had some family at the time, and I got baptized here in a Greek Orthodox church. And in a roundabout way, this is where I live now. So it's kind of strange. Um, yeah, it is quite strange. And actually, this is also when my parents got married as well in a Greek Orthodox
mm,
church. That's all very strange. Um, so so technically a Greek Orthodox, to the point that they made the effort to go all the way to another country to baptize me. And my brother got baptized in Greece. He was born in Greece. But again, it's sort of these technicalities or these cultural rites of passage, I guess. Got
mhm,
baptized, got the cross, and had a godfather, like godparents, and like, all these sorts of things that you just do and are very important to the culture. But there was not, there were no conversations around the dinner table about religion or God or even the church. Like to a large extent, there's even a kind of cultural connection to the Greek Orthodox Church that involves a lot of how do I put it? Like sort of paranoia, if we put it like that. Like there's lots of kind of
Mm.
paranoid ways of thinking that can come from the sort of like remnants of the church that get passed down. We didn't even really have that. There was sort of an absence of a lot of influence of the church, even from a just sort of more cultural perspective. Um, yeah, and I think in large part that's because there wasn't one. There wasn't one around. I'm sure if there was one when we grew up, we would have gone
Mm.
maybe a few times a year, but it would have been that. We
Mm.
would have gone for maybe Easter, gone for Christmas. If someone was getting baptized, would go. Um, that was the connection. And really my biggest religious influence, I think, when I was young, little, was my grandmother, so my mother's mother, who was Anglican. And so I used to go to church, an Anglican church with her quite a lot. I mean, I don't really
Mm.
know what quite a lot means, but um, that was when I was going, if I was going to church, I was going with her, and
Mhm.
it was a really beautiful old stone church. It was, I think, one of the first ones ever built in New Zealand. Um,
Wow.
and it's yeah, St. Mary's. It was beautiful. And so we would go. I would go there with her, and it was very old school. It was really high pitched choral kind of singing. Um, you know, um, I didn't really know what was going on. Again, it wasn't like my grandmother ever sort of spoke to me about, we do like explained all of what was going on. I just went. I had no idea what was happening, and I just sort of soaked it up. And I just remember standing next to her in the pews and having, having the hymn
Little
book.
hymns. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And I just remember her voice, just her voice, like a really high, really like, yeah. And I just remember the feeling. And that's
Mm.
probably for me with religion, what a lot of it is about. I had just a real resonance. It's a word I use a lot now, but I had a real resonance with all of that stuff from very early on. I had no idea what any of it meant. No one was explaining it to me. I didn't I didn't know why I was drawn to it, but I was really drawn to it. It just felt really, really important, and it felt really nourishing, and I loved it. And it was a little bit spooky at times, if I put that word to it. I remember like it was kind of like I both loved it and it was a little bit weird. Like I didn't understand what was happening. And I think
Mhm.
that kind of captures my relationship to religion and God more broadly, really. Just
Mhm.
there is a manner in which I don't really know what I'm doing or what I believe, or um, and it's kind of both scary sometimes, but really comforting. So let me see if I can try and draw this together. So I would go with her sometimes to church. I remember learning to pray through that. I remember learning about prayer. Um, and I remember like going back to her house afterwards and trying it out. Like for the first, like I was like, oh, yeah. Like this is how, I
Yeah.
had no
Yeah.
idea. I had no idea. Um,
Mhm.
and I really liked the concept of prayer. There was something about that really stuck with
Mhm.
me and always has. Like I still pray all the
Mhm.
time. Um, and so that was probably the biggest influence. And then sort of when I became like a teenager, she got very unwell and then she passed away. And like even prior to that, I think she sort of stopped going to church. I can't remember, but she got very unwell and she went into care. And so I probably stopped going to church like with her like around 10 or something. Um,
Mhm.
and then there was no church after that. Like I never went to any other churches. There was a little bit of an influence in high school of like kind of like youth Christian groups and stuff. Like that was kind of
Mhm.
becoming a thing where I was, and I never really engaged much with that. And then it was just my own, this is what I mean about my own relationship with God. Like I
Mhm.
would go to a church, but I still it was a very private thing, but I would still like at night before I went to sleep, I would almost be having like conversations with God in my head, or um and if things were tough and I was, um I was in pain, or, again, I would sort of be having, there was some sort of a conversation I was having like in my imagination or something that was very private. There was a way I would work through that with God, is how I was thinking about it. And I would ask questions and I would sort of wait, and sometimes it felt like I would get like responses within me. And all of this was just me figuring it out by myself. I don't think I really spoke to my parents about it that much. I remember one or two conversations where I tried to, it didn't really go anywhere. Um, there was a real, and this is another theme that I'm sure we'll get into, but as I look back,
Yeah.
there was a real like, gap. There was a real sort of lack, or missing pieces. In lots of respects, I had a very nice childhood, but there was a way in which I wasn't really being nourished, or kind of being shown a particular kind of interest, or um, attunement that I think I was seeking. And so I was just sort of figuring it out by myself. Like in the absence of that, I was just in my head. I had an amazing imagination, and I used to just go into my head and I lived there. And I mean, it sounds so lonely to say that now. And it probably was, to be honest, but I found like great meaning in that. And but for that, who knows what would have happened to me. But I think I see that, I see part of my relationship with God kind of operating in that space as well, especially in those early years. It was part of what I did to try and make sense of so much that was happening around me that I could not make sense of, and nobody was really helping me to make sense of. So it sort of filled a gap in that respect, perhaps. But it also means that it was sort of not clouded, I guess, in lots of other people's expectations of what I should be doing in terms of relationship with God. So, there's some pros and cons and all that. And so I'll just sort of bring it quickly to present day, and then I'll let you jump in. So it was kind of this private thing, and I used to write a lot as well. Like when I was a teenager, this is when I really started to write all the time. Like I was every day, like multiple times a day, I was writing, and probably much for the same reason. That was kind of like a friendship. Like that was just how I was making meaning of things. That was my anyway. And I was, not all of it, but lots of my writing, I look back on it now and I can see that I was sort of like almost writing to God, or like it was me writing in a relationship with God. It wasn't just like writing with no audience, if that makes sense. So that was definitely very much informed my writing. And then, I mean, you just sort of fast forward. It was like that for a long time. There was I should say too, there were painful kind of components to my childhood that, I won't talk about in any detail. But again, that I think this was, again, how I tried to make sense of that when I didn't feel I could talk to anyone about things. So again, it was that kind of filling in for something else. And then ultimately, what happened? Well, it's always been important to me, I think. And then, I mean, I met my husband, and he's more Greek than I am. He's, like both his parents are Greek. And, like he speaks fluent Greek, like, from when he was like a child. And like, I don't speak fluent Greek. And so he's very Greek, but he is one of the very few Greeks out there that's not Greek Orthodox. And so, his family are actually Pentecostal. So,
Okay.
yeah. So, that was kind of interesting. And so then, of course, when we went to get married, it was really important to me. I mean, to both of us, but I'll just speak for me because he's not here. But it was really important for me that I got married in a church. Um, and, my dad, again, as usual, even though I would say he's actually not religious, was like insisting that we must get married in a Greek Orthodox church because, we're so religious. But that was okay with me because I really wanted to get married in church. But the Greek Orthodox Church would not have a Pentecostal in their church. They would not marry a Pentecostal in their church, even though my husband was open to doing it. Um, and so then we're in this position of trying to figure out, well, where are we going to get married? And ultimately we found a really lovely Anglican church, which was happy to have a Greek Orthodox and and a Pentecostal get married. And also was a really nice connection, I think, to my childhood and to my grandmother, and that actually she was the person in my life who actually took me to a church and where I actually had church experience, outside of, going into beautiful Greek Orthodox churches and seeing how lovely they are. And so yeah, so we got married in an Anglican church, but that's kind of the rough, like, I don't know, chronology. I don't really know what I am in terms of like into denominations, or I don't know. Um, I feel deeply drawn to religion in general. I think it's a really important aspect of life. I think I definitely have some kind of connection with a God, like my own kind of personal connection with a God. Now that we have small kids, I'm like, well, what am I going to be passing on to them? Starting to become the question. So, and I just have no idea. So this is actually really timely, this conversation. I really appreciate this because it's hard to think through all of that. So there's all that. I have heaps more I could say about kind of other influences, but I might be quiet for a minute because I've been talking for a long time.
No, you're good. Yeah, I mean, it seems like what I'm trying to notice is like we very rarely perhaps stray from what our parents have done in a kind of religious sense.
Yeah.
Because even my father, he's he believed in a God, but he didn't like religion at all. Like he didn't like
Oh,
religion at all. So he just didn't like the rules and the kind of institutional structure, but he believed in a God, and I think that was a very surprising comment because I had never asked him until he started getting older. Um, and then my mother, she's always believed in a God. She's had a more, I think it was definitely more familial heritage kind of stuff because it kind of roots from like my grandmother and all that stuff. I mean, they were all Seventh-day Adventists, so it's like good old
all right.
American.
Yeah.
It's like good old American, like 19th, 18th century, I think,
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
religion.
yeah. Wow.
Um, but yeah, and it's weird because like, they're from a Spanish kind of background, so I don't
Mm,
really know how Seventh-day Adventist gets connected on the Spanish level, but um yeah, it's always been on my mother's side very strong. Like everybody's Seventh-day Adventist, basically.
wow. Okay.
Um and then I think if they're not, they're kind of just lackadaisical about,
Mhm.
they're not anything else really.
Yeah, yeah, that's right.
And that kind of just seems like the position. I was the only one that became something else later on, like a Muslim or something.
Mm,
Um, but yeah, I mean, it's so interesting kind of just noticing, like, even talking to my mother about religion was just like, there was definitely a barrier of if I pushed too far,
mm,
um, I would get her to question things that she didn't want to question.
yeah.
Um, and she kind of made note to me of like, kind of this comment of it's too late, kind of like this is already set in motion. She doesn't want to go through a kind of, I don't know if it would be a crisis or anything
Yeah.
or
Yeah,
an
she doesn't want to
existential
look too
kind of,
closely because if she looks
yeah.
too closely or deeply, yeah, I see.
Mhm. Yeah.
Mm,
And I remember, and this was conversations I had when I was a Muslim, though.
mm.
But I definitely learned something from that talk because it was kind of this like,
How long was that for? Can I just ask?
how long was that for? Oh, being Muslim?
Yeah.
So I think it was definitely before I deployed. So that was 2019. So I would say roughly 2018, I would
Okay.
say maybe
Okay.
late end of 2018.
Okay.
And then like around 20, I think it was like right when I got back from deployment. So it was like 2020, 21, something like that. Um, because I got on the butt end of 2019,
Mm,
of being, uh yeah, that I deployed. So I came back like 2020, towards the end of the year almost.
I know you're in the
Um,
middle of something, so I'm just going to throw it to one side and we can come back to it. But I would love to hear
yeah.
about how employment influenced your religious beliefs. But we
Oh,
can put it to one
yeah,
side
yeah.
and you keep
Hmm.
talking about what you're talking about. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, so anyways, during that meantime, I discovered a lot of, barriers to my parents' kind of religious understanding. One, my mother didn't want to go too much into things because, it involved, having for her to look into it. Um, and then my father, and this was interesting because there was a time before that I was like interested in Buddhism and stuff. He was totally open to any religion that I was interested in, except Islam. He had very much a problem with, which was actually quite a surprise to me.
Hmm.
Uh,
And
because
what's
I
your,
thought,
what's your father's background? What's like his cultural background and where's he from?
well, he's from Mexico.
Yeah.
Um, my grandparents on that side, well, specifically my grandmother is Catholic. I think my grandfather is also kind of not religious at all.
Okay.
So I think it's kind of a mixture of Catholic and just maybe some just form of theist rather than any denomination. Um,
Okay.
but yeah, my dad just, I think he kind of took more of my grandfather's position. But yeah, I was surprised when he was against me on that.
Why that? Why that in particular, do you think? What was it that was his fear there? What was the
I mean, I think just news stuff, just news.
yeah.
Yeah, it was a really interesting moment for me
Mm,
because in many ways I'm very sympathetic to Muslims for having literally been in their shoes,
mm.
um,
Yeah, I bet.
in very strange ways because I was having conversations that I was very uncomfortable with. One, because I was a new Muslim, and then um, it's hard to break past certain perhaps stereotypes,
Mm,
And then of course, the more complicated layer is like, well, there's like just like anybody else. There's just cultural Muslims, right? Like
yeah.
they're just doing what they think is part of the religion.
Mm,
And that's another thing to dissect and have a conversation with people
mm.
about. And that's all very hard. So yeah, I mean, I
Yeah.
think that was the biggest barrier that I discovered was, culture, not only outside of, you know, like Islam looking out, like from the outside, there's the culture that we have, right? The West and so on.
Yeah.
There's definitely a kind of way of looking at Islam that's like it's backwards, it's third world, it's, kind of there's that kind of view that's there. And then there's the one inside of it,
Mm,
which is a very interesting conversation because it's, you know, uh, it it's very ethnic based,
yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Very ethnic centered. So I was receiving alienation, ironically, from both ends.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
You
Yeah.
know,
Yeah.
and it was just like this really awkward position where I'm defending something that I'm simultaneously alienated from,
Yeah.
just because I fell in love with, something
Mm,
in there. Um,
mm.
but yeah, I mean the culture, I think that's when I became the most cognizant of culture, actually.
Yeah.
Yeah, strangely enough. That really threw me outside of my own culture and made me see like, wow, these are really the differences here. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, and then so this is the hard part of the conversation where it's like, so what does God mean? What does God look like?
Mm,
Or how can we think God
mm,
um outside of culture,
mm,
you know?
mm,
And that's a very hard thing because I think even atheists are not even immune to this either.
mm.
There's so much of culture in us. and then also there's just kind of knowledge gaps as well. Most of us again just kind of come from a lineage of history, of having a certain relation to God, but it's historical.
Mm.
And then yet take an absolute, which is interesting. I
Mm.
take an absolute. My mother had a very, very absolute kind of relation. But she, when I was young, I hated rules. I did not like any of the rules at all. Any of the religious rules, I did not like them at all. I hated waking up in the Saturday mornings to go.
Yeah.
I hated dressing up for it. I hated so many things. I think it's because as a child, I just could not comprehend, um, you know, all these rules. They just seemed not to make any sense to me.
Yeah, you weren't
Um,
linking it to anything. There was no sort of like meaning that actually meant something to you at that age, right? At that
yeah, exactly.
phase that resonated. And it's just like, yeah, this rigid set of rules. This is what we do. And
Mhm.
that's just what we're gonna do. And yeah,
Yeah.
man. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think even like when I was younger, I mean, the only thing that kind of propelled my belief in God, which is funny, was really death.
Yeah. Yep. No, I
That that
can.
was that, that was really it. I mean, I was just like, well, if there is a God, I don't, want to die and go to hell.
Yeah.
Like, and on top of that, there's, another thing, which was I was like, I have a hard time imagining, especially as a child, that there's nothing after death.
Mm,
So I also clung on to that.
yes.
And that was the most that I could cling to, um, as to why maybe I should follow some of the rules.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Take a gamble, right? Just
Yeah, take a gamble.
might as well. Uh,
Um, but eventually my mother did say, because we got tired of the rules,
mm,
that she didn't want us to lose religion. So she was just like, okay, I just want you to have a relationship with God, just have one. Of course, that was a really interesting thing for her to do on her side because as much as I was free to be like, okay, cool, I don't have to follow the rules anymore. It did leave a question that's still like, okay, so what does it mean to have a relationship with God?
yeah, that's right. That's actually
You
the hard bit. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
I actually found myself in a more groundless position from
Right.
that one when she said, well, just have a relationship with God.
Mm,
Um,
mm,
but yeah, I mean, if I were to answer your question on deployment, actually to connect that,
mm,
um, yeah, I mean, I did Ramadan, my first Ramadan in deployment in
yeah.
Afghanistan. I did it with the Muslim interpreters,
Mhm.
and I loved them. I loved talking with them. It was great to hang out with them. They were also very kind and, welcoming. We would break our fast together and eat together. Um, I did experience some resistance on my part of my command team. Some of them would, I don't know, they would just be skeptical about their intentions and
Oh,
motives. Um, so if I came out like smelling like anything, they would think that I was doing like drugs with them or something.
oh,
Um,
I see.
which, wasn't true. But,
Yeah. But it's that same, I'm hearing that same tension again between
mhm,
with the alienation, I guess, or the kind of, the suspicion, if we call it that.
mhm.
Mhm, mhm.
Yeah, yeah, and it was one of those things where like even like some of the officers I would talk to, he's like, I don't understand why they just have to wash their feet in my, our hand sink or whatever. Um, and of course to explain that is kind of like, well, I mean, maybe it doesn't have to be in the hand sink, but also at the same time, like it's where we wash dirty things. So I don't know how far we want to go on, you know, uh,
These
you
things,
know, I
these
would
things
always,
take a very, this is the problem I think with questions like that is, yeah, you almost sometimes need a 3 hour conversation to really unpack all of that too, like for someone to understand all the contextual pieces that make the simple one-line answer really land for them in something. Otherwise, it's just, you could give just a very practical answer, but they're probably just going to argue back against it again, right? Like I don't think that you get a
and
proper
I started,
invitation to understand. Yeah.
yeah, and I started learning like, I'd have to take a moment to like look at the person and just be like, is this a person that is willing to unpack with me, or is this a person that's really just not interested? You know? And so in that sense, there's a lot of, just uh, kind of just silence of just kind of like, yeah, just going on with your day.
Mm.
Um, yeah, I mean, fasting by myself, if it weren't for them, it would have been really hard, because I think everybody else was kind of like, I don't understand why you're doing this, I think it's and they would just give me their opinion about what Islam was for them. And
Wow.
so, yeah, I mean, it definitely was a very hard time for me, being Muslim, ironically, but
Yeah, I bet.
weirdly enough, it wasn't that experience wasn't what ended it for me, and I think most people would get the impression of just like, oh, he must have realized something was not true, or that he hated something about it, and something. Of course, there was things that we can all dislike and disagree about. Um, but no, I stopped, and I have no no hate for it. I actually still have a lot of love for it, and respect for it, and sympathy.
Mm.
Um, but I think for me, it just came down to a more pragmatic approach.
Yeah.
And I think on top of that, I actually didn't get to talk to Jochen about this when I said this, but I wrote this in my Substack piece.
Mm.
Was that praying 5 times a day?
Mm.
That was a very unique kind of discipline to impose on oneself
Yeah.
that sort of made me very neurotic.
Yeah.
Um, and it sort of made me live with a lot of guilt because it
Mm.
was like kind of impossible to achieve.
Mhm.
And then on top of that, I'm in a culture like America I mean, it's just weird. Like, people don't understand what you're doing. They don't understand why you need to take time out of your day at a certain time to pray. It's all very strange. It's all very inconvenient. It's
Yeah.
inconvenient for everybody,
Yes.
right? You hate to be the one that's also inconveniencing people.
Mm.
Um, and
Mm.
so it definitely made social arrangements very anxiety inducing, precisely because I'd be like, prayer's coming. How do I exit out of this situation so I can go pray? You know?
Yeah.
Um,
Very pressured.
yeah.
Very pressured. Yeah.
Mhm.
Mm. Yeah. There's there's something too there about uh conversation, or like the lack of, like even when you're talking about your mother, and I think what you said was that you didn't really speak to maybe either of your parents in depth about whether or not they really believe in a God until like later in life. Is that, I think that's kind of what you,
Yeah,
yeah.
it was like roughly when I started becoming Muslim that I started really kind of asking them.
Yeah. And I sort of reflect too with my parents, like the fact that I mean, with my dad, I did have some clearer conversations with it. And I think from time to time I've maybe had like a one or two liners with my mum about it. Um, but why, yeah, why it has taken me, or why even at this point in my life, I still don't really have clear answers around my parents' own, like it seems to be a pretty fundamental thing to know about a person that you're in some kind of close relationship with.
Mhm.
Um, I find it really interesting that it's something that we can go so long in our life and in our relationship with them and not really know for sure what it is that they believe in, or um, and I think actually also with my parents, if truth be told, I think I did used to sort of ask quite directly, but it was just always murky answers, like very murky,
Mhm.
sort of
Mhm.
uninterested, like, and changing. So one time it would be something that kind of, it sounds like, oh, they do believe in something, and the next time it was like, no. Like, so I found that very strange. But something about, I think what I'm trying to piece together here is there's something here about what it involves to really have a conversation with another person about their beliefs, what it asks of the other person, and then also obviously you in doing the asking. Um, and like I think your mother's answer is probably one that many people could relate to in terms of having someone sort of say to them, like, I mean, I would feel that too to some degree, I think, with my parents, like there's like a pushback moment where you're
Mhm.
getting the
Mhm.
signal, even if it's non-verbally, that there's no more
Mhm.
conversation here. I don't want to go any deeper into it. Like, I don't,
Mhm.
don't, don't ask more. And I
Yeah.
think that a lot of that resistance is probably, um, yeah, informed by the fact that they don't actually know. They don't want to go deeper. They don't want to look into that deeper for themselves. And that
Mhm.
even the inquiry challenges that. And that part, I mean, not even just with religion, but in general, that part I really want to be different with my kids. Like if they
Mhm.
ask me something and it challenges me in a way that um, forces me to stop and think and look at things I might not want to look at, I would really like to think that I'm not just going to say no, not going there. Like to me, it's a real missed opportunity. I mean, even if they're older, even when they're adults, I just think it's a real missed
Mhm.
opportunity to get closer to a person. To
Yeah. It's hard not feeling inadequate,
Mm,
because there's a couple of ways that people can look at these conversations.
mm,
Like for example, when I talk to my partner sometimes, um, you know, uh, the conversation is they can lead for her to have guilt over, not done the homework, right? Not feeling, basically she would feel like she hasn't been doing the work to read and investigate and try to understand her position on things.
mm,
Um, but of course, this is like, in many ways, like this is maybe an impossible ask,
mm,
right? Like there's just one like very just like pragmatic things that just sort of happen, right? Like just life, having kids, and having a work life and other stressors and finances and everything, and to have the time or be willing to have the time and the yearning to let me investigate my belief in God. That's probably something that is on the very lower tier of everybody's mind. Um, and so, yeah, it's hard to have a conversation and sort of,
mm,
kind of dwell in that insecurity, but not also feel imposed
mm,
by the insecurity. And that's also very hard, because there might be even a temptation on my end to be like, well, why aren't you curious enough? Why aren't you, and even my family have, they basically have, I can tell when I push the limits, um, because they start, and this is me not, for me, when I ask questions and I'm prodding, for me, I think it's just natural. But
yeah,
for them, they're like, stop analyzing me, stop philosophizing this, stop doing this thing that you're doing. Um, and of course, there can be moments where,
mm,
and this has also taken me a lot of reflection on myself, which is, you know, both egos feel attacked, on the one end, like I don't want to feel like I'm the one that's doing this horrible thing to them,
mm,
you know. But they also don't want to feel like they're insufficient in any way,
mm,
right? So there's something's happening where both sides are feeling like
mm,
attacked, you know.
Yeah.
and accusal may start to happen. Um,
Yeah.
yeah.
Can I just jump in for
Um,
one thing? See, for me, the insufficiency is the unwillingness to engage. Like that is like I see it as, and I think a lot of this is just because I've become a parent now. And so
mhm,
when I'm on that side of the equation, for me, I think what would be insufficient and what would be something perhaps really worthy of feeling guilty about, as opposed to this kind of guilt that we all feel, for just, you know, um, would be if my child would have come to me and want to speak about something I haven't thought about in any depth before. And if I just sort of shut them down and said, I don't want to go there because I don't know enough about it. Or like, like if to me, that would be like that from this perspective now as a parent would be an insufficiency. Um, Whereas to say to them, okay, let's do that, but actually I don't really know anything about it. But
mhm,
let's talk about it and like, what do you want to know about it? Maybe we can find some stuff out together about it. And what do you think about it? And what made you think about that? And um, that to me is the bit that I think that that's actually really all that's being asked for. And I know this is going to be different depending on the who's in the
oh,
conversation and what the
mhm,
dynamic is. Um,
yeah, yeah.
but even in equal adult relationships, even in like a romantic relationship, I
Mm,
still, for me anyway, and it's not to say I live this perfectly, but I try to see the invitation to connect, um,
mm,
even when I notice that I don't know much about the thing, or the thing that I'm going to share is probably going to be really different to the other person, and that might be uncomfortable, or
mhm,
um, you know, that's the important piece. What actually gets said is obviously secondarily important, but it's the willingness, it's the humility, it's the vulnerability, it's taking the time often, when you're too busy, you have 500 other things you could be doing with that moment. And this is especially true with kids, and to just put all that to one side and say, sure, we can talk about snakes for the fifth time today, like, and just trying to be patient. And that's well, for me anyway, it's really hard when I've got this list of other things I need to get done that day.
mhm,
Um, but it's the same.
mm,
I see this. I know religion can feel particularly vulnerable and personal in that regard. But
mm,
I think maybe too what we're circling around here too is just that the nature of it as a topic, if we call it that,
mm,
is so different to a lot of propositional knowledge that we otherwise would talk about day to day. And that there is this
yeah.
kind of mysterious, never being able to know for sure component to it, or at least not in the same ways that we usually go about
Yeah.
feeling very certain about our knowledge. So, I can't just say to my kids, well, this textbook says X, Y, Z, well, you could, there are textbooks, but you know what I mean. And so I think because of that much more mysterious ground, people feel perhaps that to make a stand for something or to suggest something about their own beliefs in that arena is somehow more vulnerable. It involves more, I guess, faith. Like it involves more of some kind of judgment that they're making, or something that says something that's more deeply personal about them, as opposed to just reciting propositional knowledge that they know. Like, yes, I learnt my capitals of the countries, and I can tell you, like the capital of this
Yeah.
one's like, or I can tell you how, the stock market works, or, like it,
Mhm,
because it's much, yeah, it opens up to in some ways seeing a person in a much more vulnerable light, to see how they deal with issues like this. That's what I think. I think there's something about it that um yeah, draws on a person's ability to be able to step out of the nice kind of nest of,
mhm.
here's our kind of, I don't know, factual knowledge base that we live in.
Yeah.
And now you have to
I,
make some, yeah, big decisions for yourself.
yeah. I, with my partner,
Mm,
she had like a very strong evangelical background.
All right.
So black and white thinking perhaps is
Yes.
kind of like her
Yes.
kind of realm of habit, right? Like there's a right and there's a wrong,
And that's just
and
how it is. Yep.
right, that's just how it is. And and so encountering me has been like the most undoing, right? Like just the kind of conversations we have are probably can be the most tensing conversations.
Yeah.
Um, but what I've learned is that one, she gets great anxiety from me asking, okay, so what do you think about this? Or what's on your mind about this? Especially if I'm talking about something philosophical or something like that, because she feels the pressure to give something intellectual for something that she has no idea
Yeah.
what I'm saying or anything. So actually I've switched the question.
Hmm.
Instead of asking her what do you think, I said, so what are you feeling
Yeah, that's
right
great.
now?
Yeah.
Like, what are you feeling right now? And it's always been like very impressive for me to just be like, wow, this is the shortcut to like,
Yeah.
her expressing something that she can't express because fundamentally I can't ask her to give a kind of formulation of what she's understanding or
Mm.
whatever, but there is a feeling, and it could be anxiety or frustration, and she's able to say those things more willingly than me saying, so like, what's your answer, like, what's your answer? But just to update my move for doing this series
Mm.
is that uh I've been reading. Okay, so one, yeah, I've been having a lot of anxiety over, meaning of life and so on. And I think it was because after I was really loving the pessimistic position. One, it was really great. I think it was really soothing and great for a while.
Mm.
But the pessimistic position after a while gets what I would say kind of boring. You know, like you just ask the pessimist, like, okay, like like yeah, it's the same thing. Life is
One note.
meaningless. You're gonna die. It always ends on the same kind of note.
Mm.
Um, so I read someone like Marion Milner. I
Mm.
don't know if you ever got to read her.
Yeah.
She's kind of like a psychoanalyst, but she wrote this wonderful diary kind of autobiography called Life of One's Own.
Mm. Mhm.
And it's before she became an analyst, but she was kind of pursuing her own treatment in psychoanalysis. And she was trying to discover what gives her great pleasure initially. And so I started, as I was reading her, I started doing a lot of journal writings.
Mm.
And I would do associative journal writings. And it was really good and it was really healing for me. I noticed a lot about myself. Um, but then it got to this point in the book where she started realizing it's not about what gives her pleasure or gives her displeasure, or sort of listing all these categorical things for herself. She started noticing that there's a sort of way of looking at things
Mm.
that give great meaning.
Mm.
And that there's a sort of way of looking at things that allows you to forget yourself.
Yeah.
And that, for me, was the most pivotal realization. When I read it, I said, yes, that is it.
Mm.
That is it. It's this kind of attention, because we all want a kind of definition about, my meaning of life is this,
Yeah.
my role is this, and we are going to do this, and then so on. And I would try to crave that, but I would always fall into a kind of anxiety about those things. So this is what led me to the idea of God again,
Mm.
because the mystics, and it reminded me of the love for the mystics, because the love for the mystics always talk about, they're kind of like romantic hippies in a way, a
Yeah.
little bit.
Yeah.
But they understand the darkness and the dread involved in kind of pursuing a path of love for God. Um, So I started really thinking about this more. I said, well, God is not something that I can, I think it's a sort of presupposition you just have to play out, really,
Yes.
right? Like, I don't think it's something that I should come in with full confidence
Yeah.
about knowing. But it is a presupposition that one should play out if they're willing to.
Yeah.
And I guess you could say after reading Marion Milner, I was willing to play it out. And then I realized this beauty of self-forgetting.
Mm.
What does it mean to self-forget? And then, you know, this idea of almost you could say getting rid of the ego.
Mm.
Um,
Yeah.
I just sort of I started doing this practice. It's called centering heart. It's called like a centering prayer.
Okay.
Um, and I've been doing it for like morning and night. I try to do both parts of the day. It's hard when I'm working, but
Yeah. Yeah.
um, man, the unconscious really unloads on you when you just sit there for 20 minutes, almost kind of like doing something similar to like meditation.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Yep.
and I've had memories surface up that I have never even thought I had.
Yep.
And
It's
I was
crazy.
like, yeah, I was like, wow. And then I started thinking this. I said, my capacity for silence really shows whether I'm capable of enduring this sort of
Yeah.
path to God or something like that.
Yeah.
Because when you sit there in silence, like you would never expect. Yeah, you're gonna have distracting thoughts, about, life and
Oh,
stresses, and then all of a sudden things start bubbling up. Um,
they really do bubble up, don't they? Like it's this
yeah,
kind of this
yeah,
emergent state. Yeah.
yeah, and it's wild to me. And I had this one moment where I was almost in tears because I realized that my suffering
Mm.
and other people's suffering are on this same kind of murky thing. Like I was like, if I could sit for 20 minutes in silence and discover things about myself that I was not intending to discover at all, then everything that I understand about another person is just completely murky. I have no idea. I have no idea how much they're suffering. I
Yeah.
have no idea. And it opened my heart much more.
Yeah.
And then, the problem is that you can't maintain that kind of open heart receptivity, right? I knew in that moment that's what I wanted. I wanted that open-hearted receptivity, but it's so much pain, you know?
Yeah. 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 Wow.
Yeah.
That's incredible. Um, mm. I mean, these sorts of conversations always bring me back around to the perennial question, like what even is the self? Um, like even just the way we put the words together, like that I could sit there for 20 minutes in
Mm.
silence and become aware of things about myself that I didn't even know. Like, what is it? So then what
Yeah.
is that? Like it's just it all
Yeah.
becomes
Mhm.
a great mystery. And I think I don't know if you have seen any of the recent conversations I've had. I had a couple, or I had one with Daniel as well, about authentic resonance.
Mm.
Um, but I've been thinking about, just in a really brief way, I've been thinking about like the felt sense of when you feel as though you're in contact with um, authenticity. I use the example of making a decision about something. Like when you go to make a decision that you're going to do something or not do something in a particular moment, that it can come sometimes with like this felt sense that you just know you're good with it, you're confident with it, no matter what happens on the other side, that it feels
Mm.
like it's coming from some particular place that is less clouded by all our defensive stuff and it feels more like it's perhaps from a sacred source. I don't really know. I don't really know what it is I'm describing, but
Mhm.
the resonance refers to the felt sense. Like I really do believe there is a felt sense that we have when we're in connection with some guiding force inside or something that allows us a confidence no matter what happens on the other side of it. And then when I spoke to Daniel about it, we sort of linked it to self-forgetting, which is something he talks about a lot. And then as you're talking now, I'm almost wondering if it's sort of more like a sacred resonance or something. I wasn't entirely sure about the authentic part of that phrase. It seems like, for me anyway, it seems like what I'm trying to get in touch with that idea is and maybe this is what you're referring to too when you talk about sitting there silently for 20 minutes and how things just kind of emerge to you. That maybe that is some kind of more sacred process, or maybe there is some, I mean, sacred might not be the right word, but there's some connection here I see to what God means for me. And maybe that just goes back to the manner in which I had relationship with God when I was younger, was to sit silently for longer than 20 minutes, and it was all sort of happening internally, if we call it that. But there was a real sense that I was in contact with something that was not of myself alone, if that makes sense. And this idea of something that is able to work through me in particular at particular times, if I'm able to allow it. But I guess I guess when you're talking about that, sitting there for 20 minutes in silence and these sort of memories bubble up that you weren't even aware that you had. But also strangely, I find with that sometimes too, it's like, I never know how to describe it. It's like a memory comes to the surface and I'm like, oh wow, like I've never remembered that before, but somehow I'm like, yeah, but that's definitely a memory. I know it happened. Like, so it's kind of like simultaneously the same thing. Like it's almost like I must have kind of remembered it at some point, because it does feel familiar. Anyway, yeah, that's an aside. But I wonder about the process of that is what I'm trying to get at. I wonder about what is going on that makes the decision, if we call it that, for which bit to bubble up, like which memory is going to bubble up right now. Like, is it a completely just random process of bringing down kind of the barriers and then particular memories come up? Or like, is there some kind of, I don't know if it's divine intervention, but there's some kind of manner in which we could even tune into the process of watching what emerges and seeing that as perhaps pointing to something important for us, or that can give you information as well. Like it may be that those particular memories that are coming back to you now may be for, could be used in some particular manner in this moment in your life that, may be particularly enriching or something. Or, I guess if we think about it as timing, why now? Why those memories come back to you right now, as opposed to other ones that may come to you at some other point. But there is this whole universe, if we call it that, going on inside, underneath, in the unconscious layer, if we call it that at least, that is just sitting there waiting, and that we can absolutely connect into to some degree, if we just slow down. But it seems like everything around us is geared towards doing the opposite, and distracting us away from it. And I mean, that to me sits perfectly with, well, somewhat perfectly. But I guess what I meant, like for me, what like relationship with God was like in my earlier life. It was when I sat alone, slowly, quietly. It really wasn't just me there somehow. There was some other processes, some other thing that I was tuning into. And I have no idea why, but I've just never wavered on that. Like it doesn't seem, I mean, maybe somewhat, but not really. It really does just seem like there is something else happening there, that is not me. And I don't know where that came from. One other thing just to throw into the mix, I don't know how relevant it is, but my mind often when I think about this does go to like when I was young, my dad had he was obsessed with music, and he would just like play like all this like old Greek music like loud in the house, in the car, to the point that's embarrassing, but I also loved it. And it was like really old school. I mean, he would play Greek pop music, which is just as cool. But it was just like this weird, and there's something about the Greek language, and I didn't really understand it. Like I had vocabulary in Greek, but I didn't have like grammar. I didn't understand like sentence structure and stuff when I was young. I do better now. Um, but so like it was like kind of impenetrable in terms of meaning, and yet I could just feel the meaning. And there was so much emotion in Greek singing. And the dancing, and like he would get these like videotapes like sent to him from Greece of like the people singing like in the like tavernas, and like and like playing the instruments, and I could have that on the TV, and I was just seeped in this stuff. And there's something about all of that that really feels kind of it's like approaching something to do with like religious for me. I don't know how to describe it. It's the
Mhm.
same, it's that same kind of mystery that I would like. It's a body sensation, I think. It's like I would feel a certain way when I was engaging in this stuff and like listening to this music, and I still get it now when I listen to it. And certain Greek instruments, um and this music is really, really seeped in, and it's seeped in like really old Greek poetry is often like the lyrics, and it's obviously, got a lot of emotional history associated with it that makes it so heavy and sort of deep in that regard. But like resonance, speak about resonance, that was like my childhood was just full of this like resonance from Greek music that I didn't really understand the lyrics. Greek poetry, just poetry in general. I used to read poetry. I was obsessed with reading poetry. No one was breaking down what any of this meant for me. I had no idea. I just sort of like the sound of the words as they went together. I didn't know what any of it meant. There was a real approaching of mysterious things that just had some sort of felt sense, like they were really important and meaningful, even though they were impenetrable to some degree. I couldn't understand
Mhm.
them. That has always been with me. And I think that is how I would describe what religion is for me, because I don't have a set of doctrines. I don't, but there's
Yeah.
something about me that I would say is deeply religious in the sense of my belief in God, whatever that means. Um,
Mhm.
so why did I share that now? What were we talking about? Uh, Resonance. We're talking about authentic. Oh, you're talking about the that what is it? The centering prayer that you do.
Uh-huh.
Mm. Yeah, and there's something about prayer too, I think. Yeah, I don't know if there's anything there that you want to jump in on, but
Yeah, I mean, so like it's interesting, like, when this is all, it depends what kind of philosophy of like pursuing the contemplative path or something like that. There's different manuals for it, but I've been reading some of them.
Mhm.
People like Saint Teresa of Avila, and I've been reading Thomas Merton. I really love Thomas Merton, but I've been reading his idea of contemplative prayer.
Yeah.
And the one thing that is, I feel like psychoanalysis, for example, because I've been thinking a lot about psychoanalysis and like contemplation, like what's their differences,
Yeah.
or what seemingly their differences is like. I feel like psychoanalysis, in a very broad stroke, very, very broad stroke, is the one asking, why is it that you relate to your particular contents the way that you do versus other ways?
Yeah.
Why is that the only way of relating to your contents of unconscious,
Mhm.
versus other ways? So psychoanalysis kind of provokes a kind of re-relation
Mhm.
to these contents,
Yeah.
right? The contemplative path, it seems, I would say, I'm still working on this, but is that when you read people like Thomas Merton and Teresa of Avila, these contents have purpose for them, but they're more on the side of not necessarily re-relating to them,
Yeah.
but sort of witnessing them
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
releasing them,
Yeah.
right? And and they talk about the dangers, right? Because the dangers of feeling insufficient,
Mm.
like distracted in prayer, for example, like it could be a temptation for me being like, oh, my, unconscious unloaded, so I wasn't actually focusing on the actual prayer or the um but actually this is the whole process though. The whole process is to realize that you are in the midst of a narrative.
Mm.
You have caught yourself
Mm-hmm.
in a narrative.
Mm-hmm.
And so I didn't explain centering prayer. So let me explain centering prayer. Centering prayer is relatively simple, but also when I thought about it too much, it made it super complex for me. So I make it simple for myself. Um, so centering prayer is basically, you kind of sit like you would do like a meditation, basically, or you could sit on chair or
Mm-hmm.
floor, and you pick what they call a sacred word.
Mm-hmm.
So you could pick like Amen, Jesus, or you could pick something powerful for you, kind of like love or let go. Typically like one syllable kind of word. Um, and so the way this is a little different from like meditation is that meditation is always has a one-pointed focus.
Mm-hmm.
So you either focus on your breathing, and so you always try to focus on your breathing versus the
Mm-hmm.
thoughts that surface up, or just redirect yourself to your breathing instead of fixating on thoughts.
Yeah.
Centering prayer doesn't have a focus. The focus is on the releasement.
Mm-hmm.
That's the weird part, where I could argue there is a kind of focus, but really the focus is on the negation,
Mm-hmm.
not the going back to a focus.
Mm-hmm.
So the negation is that the moment you realize that you are caught in something, you're caught in a narrative, you say your sacred word.
Mm-hmm.
And it's supposed to do like this kind of like releasement, right?
Right.
This kind of like gentle letting go, or kind of that's how you're supposed to look at it, like a gentle letting go versus like you're just smashing it down.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, that's right.
Um,
Okay.
that can be the temptation of just being like, no, no, I'm not supposed to have any thoughts. No, you're supposed to be open to having thoughts. It's just when they arise, you let them go. And so once you catch yourself, you say your sacred word, and then you begin the process again. And then you'll find yourself that, you'll be saying, the sacred word many times
Yeah,
because
yeah.
your mind is constantly fluttering.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I think Thomas Keating is the one that came up with this process a bit. And he actually says, there's a story about like a nun that was having a hard time with this prayer, and she's like, 75 times I was saying the sacred, word, whatever. And he's like, . times to return to God.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, and so, yeah, so what I notice is that in distractions, or these contents, they have a kind of utility to them, but they shouldn't be used for discouragement,
Mm-hmm.
right? They're sort of the impetus to just keep going, right? And I think that they also point out the dangers of like relying on like what they call like spiritual cookies. Like I had a Catholic priest that explained like, spiritual cookies are just like, you know, praying should always, you can become too dependent on prayer, feeling good and feeling right and so on. Because if it's always like that, then it can deter you from the negativity that one can encounter.
Yeah.
And it doesn't mean that you're losing progress, or it doesn't mean anything.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so, yeah, I've been really thinking it's such an interesting relation, the way psychoanalysis looks at the relation to the contents.
Yeah.
They want to work with it, and then the mystical contemplative path seems to have an understanding of these are important, um, but these should be acknowledged, basically,
Mm-hmm.
and sort of let go.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but
Yeah.
I've noticed in that process how attached I was to certain memories and certain things. And I think after kind of just doing this for a couple of weeks, I started to kind of almost like a muscle, um, become more conscious of resistances
Mm.
that
Hmm.
emerge.
Hmm.
Because I think,
Yeah.
yeah, it's really thrown me out of myself because I'm able to catch more of these moments where back then I would have just gone straight into the narrative. Oh, here it goes again, you know. And then you catch yourself and you're just like, oh wow, there's something's happening. You know, like,
Yeah, it's a watching it's like a watching the process of you kind of
mhm,
unfolding in real time from a somewhat separate position. Like
mhm,
it's trying to purposely watch how that process otherwise automatically unfolds. Um, but I hear you. It sounds like in the contemplative prayer kind of way. Um, it's done more from a position of seeing it so you can try and almost relinquish it, like seeing it with the hope of kind of stepping aside from it, or it's like going into a different mode almost, as opposed to, yeah, something that I think you're calling more the psychoanalytic approach, which would be the, well, let's get in there then and rearrange, like what let's tinker with the engine kind of thing,
mhm, mhm,
which I kind of see them as both having a place. Um,
mhm, mhm,
I mean, I find it hard to imagine. I know, of course, it's obviously possible, but I find it hard to imagine what life would look like um, if one was just constantly trying to be in that position of watching the process of the self unfolding, like from that more sort of contemplating position, um,
mhm.
and relinquishing. I think they're both important. Um, but there is the way that you describe that centering prayer. Sounds to me like there's also a humility involved, which is to do with maybe not really believing that you have the power to just kind of smash something out of you, or like, like it's that kind of that gentle approach is, but also sort of comes with maybe even like a hope or a faith that,
Mhm.
asking something to help you to let go of it, if we think about it like that. Perhaps that is part of also what's happening. Um, it involves more humility versus something that is much more active, like, oh, I see how that system's operating, so I'm going to get in there now and generate these thoughts instead to kind of fix those ones, or to try and, push those ones aside. Um, it's stepping aside from this automated sort of system or process, and being humble and kind of trying to let go of what it is that you see is occurring there that is keeping you shackled. Like it ultimately keeps you in a more shackled position. Like all of these well, not all, but I'm sure much of what you become aware of there are things that can be limiting. Um,
Mhm.
and
Mhm.
obviously there's a place and a need and a desire for some type of boundaries, and to have some kind of limitation. Um, but is that part of what you understand is going on with the centering prayer? Is that part of it is about, and during the prayer, at least, it's an experience of what it means to step outside of what is otherwise sort of our everyday operating mode. Um, and and in doing so, almost a recognition of how little perhaps we have control over. I don't know. What do you think about anything I've said there?
Yeah, I mean, you know, it's really put me in a different position because it's like, I've been really paying attention to
Mm.
how often I want to intellectualize something.
Mm.
And actually, that was something that I noticed in my own associative journals.
Yeah, yeah.
It was really interesting to notice. I would catch myself giving like almost like a little intellectual seminar. And then if I kept writing, all the stuff would start bubbling up.
Mm.
So it was really interesting to notice that that was the layer first, and then the other layers, the more emotional layers, would start suffering up. But I mean, there's several ways that we could look at it. Because there's one, people like talking about the non-dual perspective, right? You could say that the contemplative path is about this kind of non-dual perspective,
Sure.
right? Instead of thinking like it's, it's this and that, it could be both and. But I think I think for me, I've been really focusing more on the negation part, which is, why am I, like, for example, it really prods really good, interesting questions for me, which is like, I become more aware of this, for example, like, why do I feel um, the need to, respond to this specific person, like on Twitter, and give like an intellectual rebuttal, you know? Like, I've been really like catching that on myself. And then, all these little annoyances that I encounter about, like, I feel the need to defend something. I feel the need um to hold up a certain picture of myself, even. Um and this relates to me on a broad level, because I think for me, if God is a mystery, um then perhaps the letting go process is part of the thing. Meaning, like, when I say that I know God, I don't know God, because my speaking of God is a concept. And why is it that I'm so tempted to consolidate God into a concept? But I think it's good to have God as a concept, because that's the material to work with. That's the material to let go of, right? To let go of. And of course, they don't deny the intellectual path. I mean, like people like Thomas Merton says, you should, read theology and should kind of gather up analogies of God that and so on. But he goes, at the end of the day, though, the contemplative path is this kind of darkness, you know. It's this darkness, it's this fogginess, it's this humility, utter dependence, and you're just like having to let go. And he even talks about like the dangers of, like, what I'm doing right now, just like trying to advocate, for the contemplative path, as if I could convince anyone of why we should do it. And almost giving, like, very like philosophy type answers. Um, but yeah, this letting go, this detachment, and detachment gets a very bad name, I think. And like, because we think we're tempted to think like indifference or something, like you telling me I shouldn't like care about my children or something, or something like that. And it's weird, because detachment and compassion, and I've been thinking about this word compassion a lot, like, come together with passion, suffering together. I think if we do detachment well enough, if we're gifted it, I would say, if we're gifted this mode of detachment, we can really be compassionate with each other, right? Or at the very least, I'm able to be compassionate with somebody else, because I'm able to suffer with them. Because at least on one side of the conversation, one is able to not get caught up in their egoic narratives, right? And that is like such that's such a hard and such a it's a great thing if you can do it. It's such a great thing if you're able to do it, and you're sort of like gifted it, in the sense of like God gives it to you. There's grace involved in this kind of gifting, versus like versus this idea of like, oh, I've been doing this path for a while and I've earned it or something. It's
Yeah.
the mystical path is always like a path of like humility, and you're just
Mm,
it's a kind of hope. It's a semi quasi, semi. It's
mm,
almost like a quasi pessimistic position where you understand that you're hopeless and you're helpless
mm,
and you're dependent. And it's this maintaining of this poverty
mm.
that can leave you open to doing God's will, you could say. That kind of resonance that you're talking about. So
Yeah.
I've been really focusing on what does it really mean to be like impoverished,
Mm,
in myself. And I think having this metaphor of like poverty, impoverishment, um, has not only revealed a lot of things about myself,
mm,
like there might be like a lot of anger, a lot of suffering, a lot of everything involved, but then there is these moments when you can like look at another human being
mm.
and be like, I know they're going through the same thing. Like I know they have the same thing.
Yeah.
And it's that moment that perhaps you could see them as they are.
Yeah.
Um,
Yes.
and for me, it's definitely on the more human connected level that I think, really God shines through. Like for me, it's always been that. That's why I've always loved Martin Buber. It's always that human connection. So I've been really focusing on like, what does it mean to have this, open heart, compassion, receptivity versus in always an intellectual way, which I've always been in.
Mm,
And I'm sort of trying to take a step back away from that a little bit and not trying to do as much intellectualizing and arguments and, and so on. Because I've realized what I've really been missing is just this cultivation of just like openness, receptivity, and I think the intellect is great. I mean, it's opened my mind, but it hasn't opened my heart. Like, you know.
oh, and yeah, and like the intellectual domain can operate, especially when you're good at it, can
Mm,
operate as just another set of defenses against, like not always, there's obviously a place for it.
mm,
Um,
mm,
but when that is what you are mostly engaging with, then you find that you're mostly trying to put order to things and to because I guess what I'm hearing you talk about there too is it sounds like a lot of trying to strip away what you think is known to purposely face the I guess the untellable, the massive unknown, like that potentially that is all there is.
mm,
And that, often when we're engaging in with the intellect, we are actually doing trying to buttress ourselves with all the stuff we know. And if we don't know it, we'll just talk long enough and figure it out, and then we'll know. And it's like kind of like a excavation or something, or um, piecing something together to feel more confident on the other side, to feel like we know more. Not always, but
yeah,
um,
yeah,
you know. Um, but there is something about purposely stepping into the dark and into the unknown, with the intention that that you actually want to, that you are willing to be there in the unknown.
mm,
Not, you don't step into it kind of necessarily with the hope that it's going to reveal lots, but it's actually just
mm,
being in it. Um,
mm, mm,
and I think even just emotions and the emotional landscape is a bit like that in society these days, because we
mm,
really don't spend much time doing anything meaningful with emotional literacy in culture at large. There's lots of talk
mm,
about it, but I think it's all very superficial and um, uh, ideologically motivated. I don't know, but it seems to have like a particular flavor to it, quite puritanical in many ways too. Um,
mm,
but I guess the parallel I'm drawing is as you talk about detachment. I was thinking a little bit, as I usually do, about being in the therapy room, and what it is to be with someone as a therapist, um,
mm,
and to simultaneously somehow be like very involved and like this person's my sole focus right now, and yet obviously there's some level of, I can't let every single client become some integral part of my life and I go home and agonize over them, and that's not possible. So there is some way of being with another person, more somewhat being detached, and it might be a different kind of detachment to what you're talking about. That is really important in that context too. When you are talking about detachment, I think, and you're talking about how some people can see that as being mean, or I think it depends exactly what you're what you're inferring, you're detaching yourself from. Like detachment from what in particular? What does it mean for you, that detachment? Detachment from
Yeah.
what is known? Detachment from your current understanding?
I think it's, I think it's like it's weird, right? Because
Mm,
when I read um these sociological, I was in my sociology class about happiness,
mm,
and they were giving us research on charity
mm,
and the limits of charity, right? They're saying that people can get burnout
mm,
from, because of themselves, because, there's just sort of limits. What I find interesting in this, I think it for me is an exploratory process, but like religions like Buddhism and some esoteric forms of like Christianity and stuff, is that once you get rid of the occupation of yourself,
mm,
the the report is that you tap into this abundance of energy, and that you're able to give and be compassionate almost without this kind of limits. Of course, it's
yeah,
limited in the sense of that perhaps you cannot maintain
sure.
the detachment long enough to do it. But their argument is that if you're preoccupying yourself with I,
Mm,
like I have this wonderful example of the time I took these random people in my car and I drove them somewhere,
mhm.
and then they just got out, right? And I was kind of jaded because I was like, they didn't say thank you, they didn't ask my name, they didn't like
You're
say,
waiting for like the gratitude. Yeah.
right, 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 like they didn't say anything. And then I started laughing at myself because
Mm,
I was expecting a kind of return,
yeah, that's right.
from doing this. And I think that the argument could be made is that, you know, and this is why I was focusing on poverty. This is why I
Mhm.
was focusing on poverty, because what does it mean to do good
Yeah.
in a state of poverty? And I've noticed it's very hard because there's a lot of people that say, well, you should demand respect for yourself. You should not put up with that.
Yeah.
And I think there takes a kind of,
Mm,
I don't think it's as black and white, and I also don't think it's as black and white to dismiss it, but there takes a kind of nuance to this kind of decision making, I think.
mhm,
But I think for the most part,
mm,
when people talk about doing something good and then demanding respect, I think the path, this kind of path to God thing is it's kind of odd because it kind of tells me what is it that I want respect for exactly?
yeah.
Like what is it that I want from doing this? It almost kind of gets rid of the turmoil or perhaps the supplementary suffering that gets added on when one decides to do something good and compassionate. And it's very hard to not come away wanting to do something good and compassionate without expecting something in return,
Mm,
right? Without not expecting some type of recognition.
Yeah.
And the thing is, people will say, well, there's nothing wrong with doing something good and then feeling good about it. And I agree, because I'm not interested in moralizing the whole thing. Um, but I will say that, when it comes to, when Buddhism talks about it, and when mysticism and Christianity talks about it, they're talking about, even if it's bad,
Mm.
even if there is nothing to be gained from this, you do this good thing, right? And that is the kind of poverty and emptiness that is it's a lot of hard work to work with. It's a lot, because you want to say something like, what about, what do I deserve? What about what I want? What about,
Oh yeah.
some recognition,
Oh, yeah.
you know, and it goes into this concept of what do I want? What is it that I'm not getting? And
Mm.
there you can see, I feel like with that method, I've seen the most ego resistances with myself, right? And of course, psychoanalysis could be supplemented on top of this about why do I want that?
Yeah.
What is it about this that I want that makes me feel good? What is it about this that feels like I deserve it? Um, and so this capacity to be in poverty, and then also in silence,
Mm.
being able to let people think what they think of you
Yeah.
is a kind of brutality
Oh
that,
yeah. Oh
right?
yeah.
Because we want to jump in and be like, no, 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 you've misunderstood me, and
Mhm.
so on. And yeah, I work at the front desk of urgent care, so I feel like I'm constantly misunderstood.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
then when I'm looking at them, I see it, I can see that they're just
Yeah.
upset, they're frustrated. I am the perfect face for projection, when there's a
Cool.
bad day or anything goes
And
wrong.
at urgent care, yeah,
Yeah, yeah,
that's probably all
exactly.
you're getting. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Right.
That's right.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah. Mm, I think with the psychoanalysis, like there is a kind of undoing that you can do that
mhm,
you know what I'm saying? There is a kind of
mhm,
undoing that is possible. Um,
mhm,
and I think also what you're describing with something more like the centering prayer, it's a different way of going about it. Um,
mhm,
I think there are different ways of going about something similar, but one is much more, I agree with you, one is much more kind of in the arena of like an individual person, let's say, versus something like what it sounds like with the centering prayer as an example is much more about connecting to something bigger. I mean, that's putting it in very basic terms.
yeah,
Uh,
yeah,
but yeah, there's a lot that you just said, a lot of examples that you just gave there that really do link to parenting for me. Um, because when you become a parent, it's a kind of, well, at least for me and many people I know, it's a kind of relationship where all of a sudden you just find that you're much more willing and you need to just find ways to be able to do things that actually you might never put up with in any other kind of relationship. Like, the way that my kids are with me, sometimes I would never put up with that in some other kind of relationship. But what are you going to do? They're your kids, right? And so there's a lot that you said there, and I think the doing good things and noticing that thing inside you that's like, well, where's the thank you coming? Or like when am I going to get that feeling of like, oh, I did something really good today, or like waiting for the return. Um, I've been really, really tuned into that since becoming a parent, because there is so much that you do that is completely thankless, um, that you are actually it's actually painful to do, right? It's also
mhm, mhm,
like even physically, is agonizing, and but there's no question inside you that it needs to be done for this person, for this little human.
mhm,
and that it's a real sacrifice. There's a real sacrificing that kind of comes on that is so different to any other kind of relationship that I've ever had. The amount of it, just one after the other, and then, and you become, well, I did anyway, intimately in touch with all the parts inside yourself that are waiting for the accolade, or when do I get my time? Like the whiny things that I would hear myself protesting when I was sleep deprived and like trying to get my kids to sleep at night. Just like what about me? When do I get to sleep? Like these like really like childlike whiny but that's what was going on. Like and just all the stuff in my head that was going on, and but the needing to be able to somehow step outside of that and do the thing that needs to be done for from this place of love. But operating from that place, I think part of what you're pointing out is it can also be painful. It can also involve our own our own, I mean, you're talking about it as like poverty, but our own I don't want to use the word detriment, but taking something away that might otherwise we might have been able to hold on to for ourselves for longer, or it's the I think I think there's going to be less focus on something like that when it comes to psychoanalysis. That is definitely something that I hear that's different. This tapping into what you're talking about, this kind of broader compassion, or this access to some kind of unlimited sense of open-hearted compassion that you're able to provide.
And to add on, it's kind of like it's such a what's being asked is like almost impossible, because it's like we're always being aware about whether we're doing good or bad, in some sense, right? In a very broad sense. And then what I'm talking about is that the argument is to be able to not be aware about whether you're doing the good, right? Because the moment that you catch yourself being like, I'm doing something good for my kids, and then they just do something so unthankful, you're like, those bastards.
Exactly. It starts the whole chain of
and then you're like, you find yourself ranting on, and you're just like, oh man, I wait till they get older, I'm gonna give them like a whole spiel about and it's just like, and that part of just being like, being caught up in am I doing good? Am I doing bad? How am I doing this?
The judging yourself, or
The judging, it's the judging, and it's funny because like psychoanalysis really works with that, right? Like it's like, because it pays attention to like, why are you judging and saying those things about yourself?
Yes.
Like it's kind of like people have really funny ways of admitting their own judgments without being like, I didn't say that about, like, for example, if I were to hear somebody else say something about themselves, they would be thinking that I'm insinuating some type of judgment on them, right? And that's kind of like a good keynote of just being like, oh, that's really interesting, because I didn't have that judgment, but they're thinking that judgment. So it gives room for questions of like, why is it that this judgment is something that kind of concerns you, or what is it about this judgment that
I
could be
agree, but
frustrating?
I do think with psychoanalysis, though, again, it's going to depend on the school and exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah, for
Not
sure.
what I do. That there is a work, like in the therapy sense, there is a working with, like there is an inquiry there about these judgments that you make on yourself and why, but it's sort of in the service of breaking lots of that down, not necessarily to rebuild it per se.
Yes, correct.
There is an
I agree.
element of breaking it down in order to get access to something that we might call more like your unconscious emotional layer. But beyond that, this is actually part of the point of what I've been trying to get to somehow with authentic resonance, is there's something else that it tends to give people access to. It's some kind of, and I've put the word authentic to it because it's kind of the best I've got. But I'm starting to think more and more that it is a little bit like clearing the way to, I think I spoke about this with Daniel, clearing the way to some kind of access point to, if we call it God, but that's not the same thing as saying that we can necessarily always access it, or like, but it's like clearing the bit where you could connect to it. So, and you're there waiting kind of for it. And you're there when the timing strikes or whatever it is. But it's there's a breaking down of defensive layers, not just so that you can kind of start to rebuild
Yeah,
that
no, I
thinking
agree with
structure
you.
again. And there is something else as well that it opens you up to. It's like this vitality or something else that opens you up
Mhm.
to. And I think that that is the bit that maybe you
Mhm.
are cultivating when you are doing more of this like centering prayer or whatever. It's that bit as opposed to needing to go through this kind of layer of, I don't know, more the psychoanalytic. I'm not sure.
I mean, I think it's very possible that, the psychoanalytic piece is more, it's obviously very dialogical, right?
Yeah.
So it's very dialogical. Um, and
Well,
I think, yeah, yeah, I mean, I agree with that. I know there's nuances for sure, for sure. But I definitely agree. I was actually I was trying to say something similar with the judgments about like, it's not because you're trying to get at the judgments to point out something,
mm,
to break past the judgments
mhm.
and reveal something about the
Yes.
self, right? And that's what's great about psychoanalysis is like if you pay attention to certain words
Mm,
and like just the way people kind of speak about themselves without any prompting,
yes.
um, those are very key signifiers to like key in on.
Actually, a really important
Um,
distinction here. Do you mind if I jump in? Or
yeah, go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
um, an important distinction here is actually that I work with ISTDP, which is intensive short-term dynamic psychotherapy, which is psychoanalytically informed, but it is a different type of therapy in that it has a particular technique for accessing the unconscious that other forms of psychoanalytic therapy don't. Um, what I mean by that is it is actually slightly different in that in working in a particular way and breaking down the defenses, the idea is that actually the unconscious unlocks. And that the experience of that is quite similar to what you were describing before when you talked about sitting silently for 20 minutes and noticing like memories
Mm,
come up that you're like, what? I've never remembered that before, or right.
mm, mm,
It's like unlocking the unconscious actually means that memories come to mind, or specific ways that material gets linked together very quickly, like very fast in a moment. The person
mm,
does it all themselves, just becomes so clear to them, um, at that it somehow helps for lots of the other suffering and the stuff to just fall away around it, and a lot of anxiety resolves. And um, but it does involve, I just wanted to add in, it does involve memories coming up, and it does involve access to um, previously unconscious material that suddenly is just available to the person in some way that is quite sudden. So this is not
mm,
like long-term psychoanalysis where you
mm,
go and sort of it's kind of over time, these things are, this is about working with a particular technique that can still take quite a long time at the front end. It depends on a person. But there
mm,
can be like the idea being that there is a particular kind of sequence that occurs whereby within one session, within sort of 5 minutes, someone's unconscious could become unlocked. And like all of a sudden, all this stuff becomes available that wasn't previously. So I did just want to make that point for anyone that's listening. It is quite different from more of a long-term psychoanalytic. So maybe it's kind of more of a combination of what we're talking about here as well.
mm.
But it
Yeah.
doesn't move to the position of ever making any kind of inference about um, something like God or access to something larger, or any of these.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, yeah, it's yeah, I mean, I think what you're pointing out is good because it definitely shows some similarities
Yeah,
from it, right?
yeah.
I think perhaps the biggest difference
Mm,
is just from the religious kind of point. It would be the kind of cultivation of virtues,
yeah.
right?
Yep.
That seems to be what stands out to me because even like Buddhism, they talk about, certain like cultivating forms of compassion versus these therapy sessions seem I think, and I'm not gonna say that therapy doesn't, because obviously it could be the byproduct of unlocking, right? Of unlocking, it could be the byproduct of just being like, oh wow, you know, I could be more compassionate to my mother because
It often is. That is the strange thing.
right,
Almost always
right,
is. Like
right.
it's actually love and kind of
Mm,
compassion take the center stage. And it's so
mhm,
natural kind of for that to happen as opposed to it being
mhm,
forced. Like I know I need to be more compassionate and kind of like pushing, jamming yourself into it. Yeah.
mhm. Yeah, and that's the thing too, right? And that's the part of the stages for the path is like also getting rid of the jamming,
Yeah.
right? Getting rid of the I'm doing.
Yeah.
I'm doing. I'm
Yeah.
being aware of me being compassionate. I'm being aware of me giving kindness right now. This is my kind deed for the day or something like that.
Yes. And God
Um,
would be so happy with me. Like, like thinking
yes,
that.
yes, yes, yes. Because then, the greatest risk, and this is the greatest risk with these paths, is like a spiritual kind of attachment. This kind of, that you're on a higher stage of spirituality than other people, and you start looking down on them, you start judging other people, or it can go the other way. You start like feeling frustrated because, you're not as far as you should be, and like you're becoming distracted. And so it becomes very much centered on a kind of hyper self-conscious awareness of
Yeah.
of yourself that can be torturous. And so you're not seeing past the judgments. And so that's why I think the self-forgetfulness is really the word, right? And I think if I were to go back to your question on detachment, it's really self-forgetfulness.
Right. Right.
Like detachment, that's what it really is can you love in such a way that you're not preoccupying yourself with
Yeah.
um,
Loving.
how good am I loving?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
or being super judgmental about it. And I haven't told you this, but I was watching this one YouTube video.
Mm.
It's about a guy that went through like Lacanian psychoanalysis,
Mhm.
and it sort of haunted me when I watched it because he goes, "Yeah, there was a one point while I was talking to my therapist, and he goes, and I was looking for feedback.
Mm.
I was looking for like, am
Mm.
I doing good? Am I
Yeah.
being good?"
Yeah.
And he goes, there was just silence for such a long time.
Mm.
And he goes, and he's like, I could feel myself like just crumbling under that pressure of just silence. And he goes, and then I realized that was like, like my thing. Like I
Mm.
was like wanting to be like a good boy, like, am I a good boy? Am I being a good boy?
Yeah.
He kind of like revealed that to him.
Yes.
And I've noticed that with my capacity for silence, whether it be small some days or less, um, I notice that can be the very mechanism.
Mm.
Like that could be like my response, right? And I think it's the same thing like having a relationship with God, like, oh, am I being good? Like I'm not hearing anything from you.
Yeah.
I'm not getting any response from you. Or something happens, it's like, oh, am I being bad? What did I do wrong? It's very revealing
Mm.
about yourself
Mm.
when you stumble into that silence.
Mhm.
And, and I catch myself, almost being tempted to do that with my partner sometimes because she has long, long silences because she gets anxiety about having to say something. So I know it's her anxiety, but then my anxiety starts kicking in where
Yeah.
I want to be like, did I say something wrong? I didn't
Yeah.
want to say something wrong,
I'm aware you're anxious now. I've done something to make you
Yes,
yeah.
yes. Yeah. And I've been trying to do instead of almost begging for a response,
Mm.
I've been sort of refraining,
Mm.
as a sort of practice to just not have a self-soothing moment for myself.
Mm.
and also trusting her.
Yeah.
It's trust. It's trust. It's not just that I have anxiety. It's that I want a reassurance, but this reassurance can be kind of can be kind of superfluous in the sense of, if I trust my partner, she will tell me
Yeah,
if there's something wrong,
that's
right?
right.
I don't need to do this kind of preemptive begging or preemptive nervous questioning of, oh my God, did I say something wrong? Is this what the silence means? And so it's really like a faith in this trust, a faith in this silence, and then sort of bearing into this, negativity of wanting reassurance, right?
It's honoring her strength too, right? That even
Yeah,
though
yeah,
at the moment, sure, I'm sure she is anxious and whatever, but like you say, it's that she's fully grown. She can be with this, and the trust of the relationship. So if she needs
yeah,
something from me, or she's having trouble with it by herself, she'll let me know. I don't need to
yeah.
step in and do the kind of. It's actually kind of an infantilizing move that we often do with people. Um,
Yes, yes,
are
yes,
you
correct.
sure you're okay? Like, are you, even my 6-year-old son tells me, like he's just stop treating me like a baby. Like he can say it to me, like, just stop checking in on me all the time. I'll let you know if I need
Mhm,
you. Um,
mhm.
and we often, like you say, are doing it to regulate our own anxiety too. But anyway, continue. I jumped in.
Yeah, no, no. I mean, yeah, that's perfectly right. It's just kind of infantilizing, and it like brings me back to, like, when I had a really like great breakthrough with my mother.
Mm,
And actually, to give the timeline, this was like within the space of maybe 1 or 2 months after our first conversation.
mm,
And it was this moment of, I was really in this infantilizing mode because I was so angry about, my inability to express to her what I wanted as a
uh,
child.
yeah, 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 I
But
remember that.
then also this infantilizing blame that I wanted to give, of just like, you're the mother. You should have known. You should have asked me. You should have questioned me further, you know. And my mom, my mom hit me with this one beautiful line.
Mm,
She goes, "How could I have known?"
mm,
You know, and it was like that line that just like completely like shook me. But I think emotionally, I was like wrecked for days,
yeah,
feeling frustration, anger, and then also a kind of anger that I've never felt before, which was, it was nobody's fault.
yeah, yeah.
That was the most pivotal moment to understand that a lot of our anger, when we perhaps really, really unload
Mm,
both perspectives,
mhm,
if we're able to,
mhm,
you'll understand that perhaps a majority of them are blameless.
mhm,
And that is, and then what do you do with all that pain?
mm.
That was the question that I was asking myself. What do you do with all that pain? You
Yeah.
know, what do you do with all, there's no one to blame. You
Mm,
cannot blame yourself. You're a child.
mm,
You cannot blame your mother. How could your mother have known?
mm,
Right?
mm.
There was such a gap of communication,
Yeah.
right? Yeah, that was,
It's
and I think
the
that really shifted things.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's the shattering too of that omnipotent other. Like, that like we all that wish for having the person who will just know what we need and respond to our needs, and be able to, like, even with like romantic partners, be able to read our mind, and
Yeah.
um and I think, with a parent, this is obviously very intense. And so
Mhm.
having coming face to face with that you're, because part of what you're coming to face with there too is just your mother, and is a just like everyone else, a flawed
Mhm.
human being who is
Mhm.
separate from you. And that in of itself can feel like a flaw, because we do want someone to not be separate from us, and just to know everything we need and just do it for us.
Mhm.
And in that separateness comes a lot of missing one another, and a lot of pain, and a lot of missteps, and a lot of not knowing, um, and a lot of being disappointed, and wishing and yearning, and all these things. And I think anger, yeah, I think anger is still we might differ a little on how we view anger. Like I still think anger is just as important to look at, regardless of whether there is like you really sign on to the fact that there is a person to blame that really did something wrong or not.
hmm hmm
But we can delve into that another time. But it's all of this, everything you just described, all of those realizations and all of that stuff that you are wrestling with there is all stuff that you're not going to get to through the intellect alone. You know,
Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, yeah, yeah.
yeah. And I
That's
I
exactly
think
right.
that's the power of really tuning into our feelings, and then also tuning like doing more of these contemplative kind of practices that you're talking about, and the stepping aside and the trying to just watch how we unfold as a process. And the conscious self versus all the other things that we can actually sort of even become aware of the tops of if we just stop and pay attention. Sometimes it's enough to start to access previously unconscious material or ordinarily unconscious material, to just be quiet and sit. So, something like just sitting still for 20 minutes, silently for 20 minutes, um, noticing how much is there that's available to us even in that time. And it's through, I guess there is some link here that it's through that process too of becoming more, at least for me, more intimately aware of what is sitting in the unconscious bin. Um, Somehow in that path there's a connection to God for me. Like there's I don't know if it's through God that's able to be accessed, or I don't really know. I haven't put language to it, but there seems to be some important um,
Mhm.
link here. It's not like I feel like I'm just getting to know myself better, but I feel like some other I am connecting into something much greater than um, the contents of myself, if we call it that.
Mm.
Yeah, yeah.
Eh,
Mm,
you could say, I mean, this is the typical calling of like know thyself or know God. If you know God, then you can know yourself, something like that.
mm,
But I mean, I guess I'm curious about, well, I guess I'll hold on that one. For me, I guess I can see it from a couple of ways. Is like I've become less interested in the intellectualization of God, even
mm,
though it is necessary to a degree. But I definitely look at it secondary
mm,
now. I feel like I've ordered it in my mind as like we really need the, without me moralizing it, we really need a kind of mode where we're just in the presence of ourselves,
mm.
you know, to in some kind of silence.
Yes.
Um, and then in this silence, you can perhaps encounter as a byproduct
Mm,
um, that you know so little about God,
mm.
and that you also want to constantly project onto God.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And I think that for me has been the most
Yes.
thing, right? Because even the relationship with my mother, right? And God is kind of like, this is what Freud critiqued about
Yeah,
God, right?
definitely. Yeah.
Right. And the thing is, like, I actually think, like, I would say Freud is right.
Mm,
Like, I would say Freud is absolutely right. Um, there is something about religion that is deeply pathological in
yes.
the sense that there is a kind of infantilizing
Yes.
going on. But then there's another side of religion. It's kind of more contemplative side. It's Journey in the Dark Night, kind of Saint John of the Cross side,
Mm,
that is saying that you have no idea
mm,
who this other is.
yeah.
And every blame that you could point to, every wound that you could point to,
Mm,
is not because of him. It's it's because you think something of him that you blame,
yes.
right? Right,
That makes sense. Yeah, 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 yeah.
right,
Yes.
right.
Mm,
And it's in this kind of anxiety and darkness and humility about even saying that you know. I mean, because even, I mean, there's an analogy to this, even to say that I only see my mother as a role,
Mm.
which is what I blame her for.
Yeah. Yeah.
You can look at God in the other sense. Am I looking at God as a role
Yeah. Yeah.
versus a versus a being?
Yeah.
What do I know of this being?
Yeah.
I only know about the role.
Mm. Mm.
God is supposedly omnipotent, all forgiving, everything. I only know about it.
Mm.
I don't know about him.
Mm.
And the same thing you could say about, our parents. Like, I know about the role. I feel like I have an idea of what a mother should be like, and so on.
Mm.
But what do I know about my mother that
Yeah.
is also not confined to the role of mother?
Yes. And that makes that's really, really well put together. Because when we look at someone in terms of the role that they play in relationship to us, then we center ourselves in that again. Like it's again from the position of us, we're kind of the
Mhm,
starting point.
mhm,
Versus again, I can hear the parallel here. There's kind of this purposeful trying to step aside and out of the way and out of the equation as much as one can to just try and be in contact with or notice the being of the other person, if we call it that. Um,
mhm,
and so much of where we're getting to now really makes me think about just power dynamics too, and sort of just the
mhm,
nature of. I think part of what we're touching on here is also a trying to step outside of some arena where there even are power dynamics necessarily, or somehow there's some shift in it.
mhm,
Um,
mhm,
And I do see that as like a stepping aside, a relinquishing kind of the standard operating procedures and just trying to get in contact with something as clearly as we can outside of any notion of power dynamics, hierarchies. It's weird though, isn't it? Because it's kind of relationality, but
mhm.
how does one experience something outside of relationality? Um, Yeah, yeah. Now I feel like I've got all these ideas in my head. Um, yeah, yeah, this is really fascinating stuff. I'm also aware of time. I'm gonna have to wrap up. I'm so sorry.
No, you're good.
Right when I feel like it's getting really good. Does anything come to mind from that I just said for you?
Um, well, I mean, yeah, I'll be mindful of your time. I'll just kind of briefly touch on it. I mean, maybe there could be something outside of relationality, but I'm very adamant about on the human perspective.
Mm.
Like for me,
Mm.
I have very little purpose for a God where I focus on God and then also dehumanize at the same time,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
So for me, it's like I rather focus on a God I don't know.
mm.
And if I can focus on a God that I don't know, can that enrich my relationality with human beings? That
Yeah,
is really, that is it. That
yeah,
that's it for me. I don't need a proof for God. I don't need to give a proof for one. I feel less inclined to. I feel like what makes me a better human being without me becoming the obstacle to being a better human being.
mm.
Um, so I think it's deeply relational, actually. I mean, it's kind of like how can I love a person without my impediments? You know?
Yeah, and you're going about it
Like,
too, though, in a way that's kind of by engaging in a process, you're kind of trying to get to that and there's a flexibility or something that comes with that. It's the
Mhm.
opposite of what we were talking about at the start of just being handed a book of rules and like here are your
Exactly.
rules and this is how you treat people and just do it and don't question it and let's not think too much about it. And then you'll be okay when you die and you know. Um, this is different. This is sort of engaging in a particular kind of practice or praxis
Mhm.
that that allows you to move towards the embodiment of that. Um,
Mhm.
and it's not necessarily fixed, I think, too. I think there's something about that. There's sort of an openness to it.
Mhm. Yeah, that's what's hard to explain too. Is that there is a definitely kind of openness
Yeah,
and it's almost like a meta praxis because it's really just a bunch of letting go
yeah, no, I know what you
that is a
mean.
process. Like the letting go is the process, that kind of self-emptying.
But there's a
And
faith with that too, like by doing
yeah.
that kind of that
Hmm.
all the rest
Hmm.
kind of emerges from there. And I think that is definitely the bit
Hmm.
that's hard to put into words for people. Um,
Hmm.
I do know what you're talking about. I do feel like we're talking about a very similar thing here. Um,
Hmm.
yeah. Uh, this has been wonderful.
Yeah.
Thank you for thinking to ask me to join in the series.
Yeah. Yeah, no worries.
Um, I'd love to
This is
do a
great.
follow-up on it at some point when
Okay.
I get time. But I appreciate it.
Yeah, no, I appreciate it too. I'm glad you could come.
Yeah,
Glad
yeah.
you could
I'm going to I'll let the recording process and then I'll just share the folder with you, yeah?
come. Okay. Yeah.
All right.
Yeah. Works.
Thanks for your time. Thanks for talking.
Yeah. All
You look
right.
after
Take care.
yourself.
It's the
All
same.
right, talk soon. Okay.
Okay. Okay.
Bye.
Bye.